So this is crafting an argument for Apologetics 5310 research writing, apologetics research and writing. And we are blessed today to have Professor Nancy Piercy with us. She is senior research scholar in our program. We are so just, again, I think blessed is really the word that comes to mind to have her as one of our professors here. She is a seasoned apologist. She is a very skilled writer, has a wide reach, and really has so much to offer us. And that was the thinking behind inviting her here for us today, to really get her to share her insight. Not everybody is able to teach every single student in every single class. So we want to tap into the expertise that we have, and we are just, again, so grateful to have her with us today. So I'm going to just give her an opportunity to share a little introduction, and then we'll be talking specifically about crafting an argument. Professor Piercy.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this, because I really appreciate having input into the students' lives and their thinking. And you asked me to start out with just a little bit of my background. And you know, it dawned on me literally as I was standing here that I probably should even start with my own conversion, because the reason I'm so excited about apologetics is because it was such a big part of my conversion. And I was raised in a Christian home, a Lutheran home, Scandinavian Lutheran. And when I was about halfway through high school, I started asking questions about how do we know Christianity is true? Really, that was my only question. How do we know it's true? I'm going to a secular, public high school. All my books are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I just want to know, how do we, be confident that what we have is truth? And unfortunately, no one could answer that question. I guess apologetics wasn't very big among Lutherans at the time. It wasn't very big among evangelicals as a whole, to tell you the truth. And here's an example. I asked a Christian college professor, why are you a Christian? And he said, works for me. I said, that's it. Expected to get some reasons from a college professor. I also had a chance to talk to a Lutheran seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes. As though it was psychological phase. And to which I thought, well, why don't you have any answers to my doubts then? So when that's the level of the answers that I got from the Christians in my life, I eventually decided maybe Christianity did not have any answers, that it was not intellectually defensible. And I very intentionally gave up my Christian background and decided it was up to me to find out what was really true, to survey the answers that are out there, different philosophies, different religions, and figure out which one was true. And I literally started walking down the hallway of the public high school I attended and to the library and pulling books off the philosophy shelf. Because I thought, since I can't get any live people to talk to me about this, maybe these dead guys, right? These dead white males, but maybe they have some answers, because after all, isn't that what philosophy is about? What is truth? How do we know it? Is there meaning to life? Is there a purpose? Is there a foundation for ethics? Or is it just true for me, true for you? And I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that if there was no God, then the answer was no. There was no meaning to life. There was no foundation for ethics. There was not even any foundation for truth. Here I am in high school, and I'm in my English class. You'll appreciate this, being an English teacher yourself. I was doodling during class. The way I thought of it was, if all I have is my puny mind, my puny brain, and the vast scope of time and space in history, how can I think it's possible for me to have some sort of universal, absolute, objective truth? Ridiculous. It seemed obviously ridiculous to me. So in English class, I was doodling the entire universe as a thought bubble in my head. So it was several years later that I ended up at the Ministry of Francis Schaeffer, which is called L'Abri, in Switzerland. I'd gone to Europe because I'd lived there as a child and I'd wanted to go back. So I ended up in Switzerland, and that was the first place that I discovered apologetics, because Francis Schaeffer's ministry was primarily apologetics. and I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned. I had no idea Christianity could be defended with reasons and logic and good arguments.
That's fantastic. And I know you've written many books, but do you want to point to a couple of them sort of as ways in which you've done that people could access?
Well, this is my little setup where I do podcasts, and authors often have their own books in the background. So
perfect.
This is still the best-selling book I have.
Okay.
All of my books have reached bestseller rank, but this is still the best-selling book, Total Truth. And Total Truth is it looks at why Christians, what are the main strategies that secular people use to marginalize Christianity and to undercut its truth claims. Before you deal with individual truth claims, you have to say the concept of truth itself has changed. And the concept of truth, well, in the secular world, it's called the fact-value split. That you have facts that are knowable by science, and that's the only really reliable form of truth. And then there's values, and since they're not directly, you can't stuff them in a test tube or study them under a microscope, and so they're not really truths anymore. They're considered private, personal preferences. What makes you feel better, and so this was one of Francis Schaeffer's main messages, by the way, as he said, the reason Christians are not successful in communicating Christian truth is because they don't realize that secular people have this new view of truth, where the minute you start talking about Christianity, they don't think you're in the realm of objective truth claims anymore. They think you're in the realm of, well, this is what's meaningful to me. And in which case, they say, well, that's nice for you, but don't bring it into the public square where we talk about what's really true.
Right. I think this might be a good setup, if it's okay, to sort of launch into our first question, and I'll kind of adjust it a little bit based on what you were just saying. So in apologetics, and particularly in this class that this video is for, 5310, you do arguments, right? We set up arguments. And based on what you're sharing here, it seems that apologetic arguments maybe have a specific or unique contour to them or approach that apologists might need to take. How do you think of argument specifically with regards to apologetics?
Yes, well, I love arguments, which sounds kind of funny, because many people do have a misunderstanding. They think arguments means being contentious, and of course it doesn't. It just means using logic to reach your conclusion. And I thought I would give another personal story to kind of illustrate how I came to really understand how to make arguments that ordinary people can understand. I mean, we expect it of philosophers, but I had a chance to be the founding editor of Breakpoint, which was a radio program hosted by Chuck Colson, who I find young people don't know so much anymore, but he was a pretty outstanding Christian leader in the evangelical world. He started a prison ministry called Prison Fellowship, but he had also worked in the Nixon White House. This is how people may actually know him. He worked in the Nixon White House and was convicted in the Watergate scandal and went to jail. And that's how he ended up starting he was converted and ended up starting a prison ministry. But he always, of course, was interested more in politics and cultural trends and so on. So he wanted to start a radio program, and I was brought on board to start it. And many radio programs run by organizations are little 5-minute things that are primarily fundraisers. They put their president on for a few minutes for a scripted program, and it's primarily a fundraiser. So they didn't think it was going to be much, but they hired me. And I said, are you kidding? We are going to make this a little nugget of Christian apologetics, Christian worldview teaching, Christian apologetics. And it's going to be a small nugget. It's radio. It's got to be light. It's got to be popular in the sense of easily accessible, but it's going to have a nugget of real teaching to it. And of course, the program took off like crazy. People were very hungry for that kind of thing. But it was not long before Breakpoint was, for example, was getting far more donations than the whole rest of the prison ministry, because the tail was wagging the dog, because people were so hungry for apologetics. And the leadership at Prison Fellowship had no idea it was going to take off like that. But it does show that people, ordinary people who don't necessarily read apologetics books or philosophy books, are hungry for the content that is in those books. And so what it takes is somebody like myself, or there's lots of good popularizers. A lot of the popularizers today are people who can read this academic literature and then present it in a way that's accessible for a broad audience. So but here's where it applies to our class. Well, first of all, I hope many of our students are going to end up being in positions like that, where they're writing in a way. Some will be more academic, but I bet a lot of our, in terms of sheer numbers, probably a lot of our students are going to end up writing for, for churches, for Christian schools, for Christianity Today type publications, working in apologetics ministries, and so on. So here's a little story though on how I discovered how to even do it. I started this a Breakpoint. It is scripted. It was like 525 words. If you think you can make a complete point in 525 words, it is very, very difficult. There's an anecdote. I'm pretty sure it's true, where C.S. Lewis once wrote a letter. And in it, he said, "I'm sorry for writing such a long letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter."
That's great.
Isn't that cool? Because being able to write something so clean and so concise, with a word count. Anyway, when I first started, there was nothing like that, and there wasn't the internet. And so I had to figure out by trial and error, how do I write a persuasive piece that is accessible to a broad audience, and by the way, also accessible auditorily. Most of us are very visual, and we don't take in information as well auditorily. So I also had to learn how to write for the ear instead of the eye. And it turns out you have to write, it has to be much more fluid. You can't have breaks. They can't see that you're starting a new paragraph, for example. So you have to have much clearer signposts. Here's where I'm going next.
That's nice. And I want to pick back up on that in a later question about that crafting, because I think what you just said is going to really funnel into their crafting the argument. That's great. But we can pick it up later. Thank you.
So I had to figure out how do you start with a clever, engaging anecdote, because you're writing for a broad audience. So you have to have some news hook or some anecdote that people will connect with. Remember that they can change that radio dial at the drop of a hat. And so that was another skill I had to develop. How do you grab them quickly so that they don't change that radio dial?
Right.
Grab them quickly with a compelling anecdote. Go into your thesis. So you have intro. Thesis, your thesis has to be pretty light. You're not going to say, it's not going to be pedantic like you can do in academic writing is much easier, because you can just say the position I'm going to argue for is this.
Right.
You can't do that, for the general public. You just have to, it's more like a tease. There's just enough of a tease so that they'll say, oh, I know where you're going, and they can follow you more easily. And then of course you unpack it with your facts and reasons. Okay, you have to support your position with facts, data, quotes from experts, 3 points, just like a normal, usually it falls into 3 points if it's persuasive, just like a normal essay. The difference is though that then you follow up with an argument. You follow up with, okay, here's why this is wrong. You have a section on why this is wrong, why the secular view doesn't work, why it's harmful, why the social impact is bad, whatever. But all your ways of critiquing the secular view. Then you have to have a section giving the Christian answer. And that was often hard to do, because I'd have to go read a whole book sometimes, to write my one paragraph, because a Christian answer on an economic issue, for example, I'd have to find a book by a Christian economist.
Mhm.
You know, a political issue, I'd have to find a book by a Christian political thinker. Education topic, I'd have to find a book on Christian education.
Mhm.
So, and by the way, you get a sense for that, how broad it was.
I was getting ready to say that. I think this is why you're such a great professor in our program, but a guest for this particular class, you know, and you'll be teaching it often too, I think, because your experience is so broad in writing about so many different things and doing your research in so many different things. You sort of are able to distill what are the qualities of writing and research that cut through all of them. So I hadn't really thought about that until you were just sharing, but as you were sharing, I was thinking that's great. That breadth of experience really is so valuable to share, for you to share.
Yeah, the current issues at the time when we started Breakpoint were abortion and homosexuality, and virtually all Christian engagement with the secular world tended to focus on them. And I told them, I had some staff writers too, eventually, when they realized that this was a daily program. No one can write a daily program, you know, a well-researched, well-edited daily program. So eventually I talked them into hiring some staff. But anyway, what I would tell my staff is we are not doing abortion and homosexuality unless
Right.
it's something truly new. We're going to do Christian worldview. We're going to defend the Christian worldview. And we had sort of a grid. So like I said, we had education topic or a pop culture topic or a science topic. Science always went over really well. By the way, you asked me about my books. So this was actually my first book was on science. So I made sure we got science topics in there.
Good.
Art and culture topics. So this is my book on art and culture topics.
Right.
And then more recently, of course, this is on homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion, and so on. So the moral issues. But I was determined that we were going to defend the whole Christian worldview
Right.
across the board. So that is another reason it became so popular, is because people weren't getting that anywhere else. Oh yeah, so I was going through the intro, thesis, build your case, argue against the secular worldview, give the Christian alternative, application.
That's nice.
When you're dealing with especially when you're dealing with a more popular audience, they want to know what to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
They're very frustrated if you just dump information on them and don't tell them, here's something you can do with it. So
Right.
application, and then of course, you have a clever kickoff at the end. So
Great.
I built this up and trained many writers. We had both freelance and staff writers. And then it was years later. I had already left Breakpoint. In fact, I think I may have been here at Houston Baptist already when I said, wait a minute, the internet has grown up. There was no internet when I started. Wait a minute, I bet somebody else has figured this out too. So I thought, what would you call it? You would call it a persuasive essay or an argumentative essay.
Mm-hmm.
So I researched both of those, and sure enough, you can find that now on the internet. They're taught in college level, they're taught in high school level.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between persuasive and argumentative tends to be that persuasive is more literary. You know, you're being persuasive, whereas argumentative is more like doom, 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 very logical. And
Right.
so it's not a huge difference, but that's
that's a nice distinction, though. I like that. Thank you. Good.
But it was exactly the same structure that I had worked out by trial and error. So that was very affirming. So now with my students, I give them the one I worked out at Breakpoint,
Mm-hmm.
and to follow up, I give them a couple of web addresses so that they can see other people saying the same thing. You know, sometimes
Right.
If somebody else says it slightly differently, sometimes it clicks more. So you
Right.
know, getting it more than one way can be helpful. So
Yeah.
that's when you say what you need to learn in order to write apologetics, I think it's learning the structure of an argument. Structure. Most students don't come. I don't know about you, Mary Beth. Dr. Baggett.
Oh,
But
that's fine.
but I find that most of my students don't come in knowing how to do a persuasive or argumentative essay. They've done a lot of more descriptive essays, follow a theme, expand on a theme. They don't come in knowing that. So I find that the most important thing for them to learn is the structure, to be really persuaded that structure is important. And you cannot unfold a logical argument unless you know how to take the argument step. Establish this point, from that follows this, from that follows this. The structure is,
I agree.
It's paramount.
I agree. I really have noticed that organization, it's almost like they're wrestling so much with the content,
yes,
but kind of forget that the organization could actually help them wrestle with the content because it gives them places to put things, So I love that. Thank you for that. And this sort of has already set, you wanted to say something, and I'll let you in just a minute. And then we can maybe segue into other things that you think help with preparation for students. But first, what were you going to say?
Oh, well, this kind of segues into that already.
Yes.
I'm teaching at the graduate level. I assume they know how to write outlines. No.
Right.
And so the first time I taught apologetics research and writing, I did not tell them to do outlines. And after several weeks, I said, guys, you're going to have to do outlines. And one of my students, the one who had the hardest time, because she's very good writer, but the structure, the organization just wasn't there.
Right.
She wandered all over the place. And she told me later, that when I told her she had to write an outline, she was offended. Because she thought that was too simple. I was taking her back to high school and that was too simple. But the minute she started writing an outline, her writing improved significantly. I mean, dramatically. And so now I do require it. I don't assume that they know how to do an outline. Because if they can get the logical structure in the outline, it's just what you said. Then they know where to put the content.
Right.
Oh, it goes here. This
right.
part goes
it's not
here.
just free floating. Right. Good. Good.
Yeah.
What other kind of preparation tips do you give your students, or do you think that students need as they enter into this apologetic argumentation or persuasion? What are some of the other, and I said things that they might need to know about the material, about themselves, and this is broad reaching, whatever you'd like to share, about the cultural moment. You've already answered so many of these things implicitly, I think, just from your own experience, but if you want to offer anything directed towards students, that would be fantastic.
Well, another skill that I teach, and again, students they come in thinking they know how to, but they don't always. How to annotate a book.
Right.
The more you annotate, or the better you annotate, the more intellectual preparation you've done before you even start writing. So knowing what to look for as you annotate a book, having the questions in mind that you want to answer. Because I'm sure you've had this experience. Sometimes you read a book and you don't know what you're looking for, and it just sort of washes over you.
Right.
So really having questions in mind based on the paper you're going to write, pinpointing exactly what you need to underline, making margin notes. When something's unclear, putting a question mark on the side, doing cross-referencing, like the author raises this issue here, but doesn't really flesh it out until 2 chapters later. So, making cross-references. And the most important one, which is one students don't know, I wonder if I have any of my books handy so I can show you. I should, but I don't know if I do. I'll just grab one quickly and see if I have one here. Oh no, it's not enough. Okay, I'll show you what I do. So,
Okay.
This is a David Bennett, who's a former homosexual. It's one of the books I read for my book, Love Thy Body. And it turned out not to be a very profound book. It's just his story. But what I do is I teach students to make a personal index at the front of their book.
Oh, that's good.
yes, it has, many books have it in it at the back, if that's helpful, but so that you can find what was important to you. And you put it under headings, like sometimes, if you know that you're going to be dealing with a certain theme, you might leave a little extra room so that every time the author touches that theme, they'll be grouped together. So that's done a lot of your work for you. So let's say, you know you're going to talk about topic X. And so when the author talks about it, you put the page number and a brief description.
That's good.
Brief summary. And you leave a little space so that next time he talks about topic X, you can put that page number and summarize it again, so that you've already got some grouping of themes. Here's this theme, and then you've got this theme, and then you've got another theme. And you know how often you pick up a book and you say, I know he talked about it. I know he talked about it somewhere. Right. I know he did. In fact, it was on the left side. You even have a mental image sometimes. I know it was on the left side under a subhead. I don't know about you, but I can picture this. But can I find it?
Right.
No.
Right. That's so nice because you have two things working together. That's great.
You have your personal index and you can quickly find, okay, topic X, he dealt with that on page 259.
Good.
This is my lifesaver. In high school, you know how they teach you to put everything on index cards? Mm-hmm. I never could keep track of index, and you lose them. Mm-hmm. These are your index cards.
Just and right there with the book, right?
With the book, and you'll never lose it.
And, so good.
And if it's a really good book, you might end up having a second page full. There's some very dense books that I've read more than once, and so right. I have, so it's just loaded with my own index. But that's a skill, especially the personal index part. That's right. A skill that most students, they've never even heard of that one.
Well, I have loved this conversation. I'm going to draw it to a close if that's okay. But maybe to sort of lead us out, I'll give you the opportunity to say, what would your final kind of piece? I know that you must have so many pieces of advice for our students, but what would you want to leave them with as they continue on finishing up this class, but also it's kind of an early class in their program, mm-hmm. as they continue into finishing the rest of it?
I sometimes get questions from people who are just who are still deciding what to study, and they'll say, if I want to be an apologist, what should I study?
Right.
And I always say, if you want to do cultural apologetics, you really have to study two things. You have to study the philosophy, and you have to stay really rooted in the arts. Mm-hmm. Good. And it's, most people by nature, by temperament, are kind of more one or the other. And so they have to be careful to stay balanced. Some people are more artistic and some people are more philosophical. But to truly do cultural apologetics, you need both. The term cultural apologetics was coined to describe what Francis Schaeffer did. Mm-hmm. We're back to Schaeffer here.
Right.
Because he was the first person to say, it's not enough to read the philosophy books. You need to look at how ideas percolate down in a culture through the arts, through literature, music, movies, even advertising, how ideas percolate down through these cultural forms.
Right.
But to do that, you have to know the ideas, or you won't recognize them. You have to know the ideas so that you recognize them when they're clothed, as a novel, for example. Right. When they're clothed in characterization and dialogue and plot and storyline. So you need to have both. And that's what I love about it, because it engages the whole person. It engages you intellectually and it engages you aesthetically. Mm-hmm. It's art and ideas. It's the creative and the cognitive. Mm-hmm. And so for students who are, I think it attracts a unique form of student even, because it is so broad.
Yes.
It attracts students who, are not narrow specialists. You can't be. It attracts students who really want that big picture, and who are both intellectually, they are intellectually astute, but they also have a really an aesthetic sensitivity. Mm-hmm.
And even the way that you've been approaching argument, I think, integrates that, where yes, argument is explaining things rationally and logically, but explaining what, right? And what are you engaging with? And so it really does bring both of those things together. And even your recognition of audience that has permeated everything that you've talked about. The audience, to whom are we talking? We're culturally embedded creatures, knowing the culture, understanding what kinds of things people are interested in, what's going to appeal to them. Those are really key, important questions. So I don't think you really can't. And your whole work, I mean, I kept thinking we were coming back to the beginning, as you said, and you mentioned specifically Schaefer, coming back to the beginning of your own conversion story, that both are together. It's not one philosophy or culture. It's both connected. Mm-hmm.
And I'll respond to the audience comment you just made too.
Yes.
That's another thing that my students find a huge change. When I'm editing their work, I'll say, the reader's not going to follow you here, or the reader won't understand this, because you need to unpack it better, or the reader won't be familiar with these concepts. You need to understand them better. And my students start saying, I never thought of the reader before.
Aren't you the reader?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I say, you're not writing for me. I have to tell them that you're not writing for the professor. They're so used to writing. They are so used to writing to the professor, and the professor, of course, knows. I mean, if you're talking about something that the professor knows, the students won't bother to unpack it.
Right.
They know the student. They know the professor's going to understand it. So you keep coming back to saying, the reader's not going to get this. The reader doesn't have enough background. Mm-hmm. You need to tell a little bit more background to this concept or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that students have commented to me is, I just never thought in terms, I never evaluated my own writing in terms of, will the reader follow this?
Right.
And by the way, like you said, and by the way, who is the reader?
Right. Well, and especially in apologetics program, because the professors, when they go out into ministry and use their apologetics work, they're not going to be writing to Christian apologetics professors. Exactly. So they definitely need to, as they're training, think about the audience to whom they're addressing their arguments. So thank you so much. Yes.
You're right. Our field, more than others, is a communication.
I think so.
It is a communication field. And a few of us probably might become, professional philosophers somewhere, but the majority of us are going to be talking to ordinary people.
Right. Well, thank you again so much for your time. And I just appreciate all this wisdom that you've offered. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here, and we can chat for a minute if you'd like. But thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.